But let's move on to the mechanics of Theros Beyond Death. So, Theros Beyond Death, the set itself, just some quick design credits. Vision design is by Ethan Flesher. He, I think, was new to Wizards when Theros first came about, and he did a ton of research to really capture the Greek top-down feel that first time. You see a lot of his fingerprints in the original Theros block, and so I think it made sense for him to be lead design here. And then Mark Gottlieb and Sam Stoddard were set design, so putting the set together in a functional space after Vision Design gave them all their crazy ideas. So a lot of times we get a lot of articles about all of the things that they tried when they were making the set and making Magic, or all of the other articles on the mothership about things that they did that didn't end up working out, or all the problems that they had. And I found there weren't a lot of that this time around. I think a lot of the mechanics were locked in, but they knew for sure their main design goal was to recapture Theros, but with the twist of the underworld. They knew they were doing the underworld. They were probably going the same direction that we were all saying, like they want to explore a different side of Theros. They want it to be resonant, and that is going to be the underworld. And so they had, in Vision Design, one mechanic they definitely wanted to do was something splashy that would capture that sense of the underworld, and they had this weird mechanic called Stygian. And there's an old card. I'm going to have to look it up. It's called Raging River. And you can read about this in the articles. I think it was in a few. It basically splits the battlefield. And with Stygian, Stygian would make it so that creatures could be on one side of the battlefield or the other. And one side of this river would be the underworld. And creatures could only attack or block each other over there. They couldn't attack or block each other on the other side. Or rather, people not in the underworld could attack and block each other, and vice versa with the underworld. And that was, going to be the resonant underworld splashy mechanic, which got summarily killed in set design. What do you guys think of Stygian and what you've read or heard about that?
I thought that Stygian was exactly what the set needed and didn't get.
Yeah.
From what I remember, I'm looking over it again now. What I remember is it felt like they really poured a lot of energy into it. There's a huge section in the article all about this, right? And I just got the vibe that even if they didn't say it explicitly, it really felt like they were really trying to make it work. They, in fact, handed it off. Like, this was the handoff mechanic. They did not switch to escape in Vision Design. That took set design to realize that. And that means that they poured at least the entire amount of exploratory and Vision Design time into things like this, or that were this, right?
Yeah.
This has been happening. We're not talking about Ikoria today, but Ikoria also had this issue of they poured a lot of energy and time into certain iterations of a mechanic, and it makes it more difficult to adjust course later. But this is like the most evident form of it, I think. They started off with something that would have carried their splash. It would have really sold the set as being underworld, right? It was a very innovative mechanic. It was a very different mechanic. It was a very flavorful mechanic. And then they lose it. They realize they can't pull it off, right? There's too many issues for balancing it. Apparently it's too difficult for digital. It was not creating fun gameplay. It didn't match how the underworld actually works, because if I remember correctly, like, you could tap to decide to go to the underworld.
Yeah.
Or you could just choose to start in the underworld. There were lots of weird problems with it, right? And so they had to scrap it, and then when they did scrap it, they got left with Escape, right? Which is fascinating, because the last time we were here, they tried doing buyback, like literal straight up buyback, or they tried doing recover, right? So it seems like Theros has this very odd inclination towards revisiting dangerous, repeating mechanics.
Wait, they tried to do that in original Theros?
Yes, in Born of the Gods, they tried to bring back recover instead of strive.
Oh.
Strive was originally recover.
Oh, weird.
Yeah, right? And so I think that, like, spiritual infection remained when they came back to Theros, and they decided to try it again, and this time they actually went with it. But you see, like, when you see Theros Beyond Death, I think more than most sets, even more than the last time we had this kind of talk, it's very clear that there's a hole in the set, that there is a giant missing part, and that they filled it in. And in the final product, you don't really, like, when you're playing with the cards, as you said, it feels like a well-oiled machine. Once the cards are interacting and once you see these connections, it doesn't feel like there's anything missing. But as an overall picture, like a jigsaw piece, you look at that and you realize that there is a giant, like, odd space where they were missing something that was very clearly meant to handle what the other mechanics are not.
Yeah.
Other mechanics are sagas, constellations, and devotion, right? And those are all returning mechanics, for one. For two, they're not splashy mechanics. Sagas and devotion might have at one point been splashy, but they're not anymore. Constellation is the exact opposite of any form of splash. It is the most workhorse way to care about enchantments possible.
Yeah.
Right? And so they really needed something for that spot that would have sold Underworld, that would have sold the tone, the feel. I don't know if Stygian was it. The stuff they're describing does not feel exactly proper. The closest they got was when they had creatures die from the living to the dead side, so every creature gets a second chance to fight, essentially, which is a cool concept, right? That sounds awesome. And I think that's why they spent so much time, is they knew they were onto something. They knew that this is the thing that they needed, and they couldn't figure it out. They couldn't crack it. And then they had to be left with something safer in a way, and that was Escape.
So Stygian reminds me of, like, a very high concept theoretical mechanic that someone in the custom Magic space would come up with. Be like, what if the battlefield was the underworld and you could cross from side to side, and maybe they would tap to go there, and like it's all theoretical concept, but then the moment you sit down and play test it, you're like, oh, this makes everything about Magic twice as difficult. Like, everything basically has menace. Combat becomes twice as complicated. Board complexity gets twice as complex. Flying feels weird because, like, it's like evasion on evasion, you know what I mean? Yeah. And it seems like a kind of mechanic that would be kicked out really early in a brainstorming session. But at the same time, it's not Vision Design's job necessarily to, like, oh, well, the number one goal of our mechanic is to make sure it works really smoothly. They need to, you know, be searching outside the box. And the thing I admire about Stygian is it would have made games feel like you are in the underworld. Like, it would warp the games significantly in a similar way that, you know, Bestow kind of warps a board, or Heroic, or just those kind of, like, Voltron-y play patterns that we were talking about with Theros. This would do that. It would make the set itself feel like you're doing something in the underworld. Instead, with Escape, I feel like there are certain creatures that I can believe are going to the underworld and coming back, but I don't feel like I, as a player, am doing something in the setting of the underworld of Theros.
Mechanically, it's just Shadow, basically. And I've always thought if they wanted to bring back Shadow, which is a not loved mechanic in R&D, they should do something where it's like, it's Shadow, but once there's something with Shadow, you can choose to be in the Shadow side or not the Shadow side.
Right.
And then sort of go from it. Like, all they really needed for Shadow to be an interesting mechanic was for you to have some way to interact with it. And it sounded like they were really trying to hit that, but then they got tied up in, like, okay, I could make this work mechanically, but if I make it work mechanically, then it's going to get really far away from the theme. And then the whole reason we're doing this is because of the theme. And then you sort of run up into, okay, well, this can't be the thing we build our set around if it's not going to actually sell the flavor perfectly of what we're trying to do.
Yeah. I think you touched on something, Carl, that's really true to this. And I don't want to spend too much more time on Stygian, even though it's a really big part of the set. But I think you said that this is a high concept thing that you've seen before. I've seen it before. I think everyone's seen it before.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that a lot of amateur designers don't realize, especially, you know, with Magic, is that if you have, like, an idea it's very like
It's been
some
had.
ideas, very likely it's been had.
Yeah.
There are some ideas that you go into very weird spots for, or that surprise you stumbled upon something that they hadn't actually thought of, But for the most part, like a lot of these base changes have been done, right? Like when I've talked to Wizards people, that sometimes when I had that interview and they ask questions, and my first idea is that like, oh yeah, this is the trick in my pocket, right? I pull it out and they go, oh yeah, we dismissed that 6 years ago. Or, yeah, we tried that in Scourge era and it didn't work. We realized it. And I'm like, oh, fantastic, right? Because that was the thing that they weren't sharing as much. You said that they've been talking a lot about Sorry, I'll rewind. Carl, you were saying that they share a lot of these things, but they don't historically. It's only recently that Mark Rosewater started to open up about mechanics that didn't work.
And I think they're very tactical about it too.
Yes.
Like they only want to share certain things that help the narrative that they're trying to sell with the set, as well as being informative and interesting. But they're not like for example, when we did our Throne of Eldraine design review, it was vastly helped by them publishing the official Vision Design handoff document online. Yeah. Like we saw exactly what Vision Design gave to set design, and we saw all kinds of mechanics that didn't work out, but we could see the seeds of them in what did happen. Yeah. We did not get to see that this time. We did not see a Vision Design handoff document, and I mean they don't have to give it to us, right? Like it is an embarrassment of design riches, all of the content they give us.
Yeah, Mark Rosewater has historically held very close to his chest the mechanics that he thought had potential.
Yeah.
And that's the big change now, is that he's starting to share mechanics that are good but didn't work, right? Either their concept was good and they couldn't find an execution, like Skirmish and War of the Spark, or in this case, they played with them. They actually played with these cards. Vision Design hands off a set that is capable of booster draft and sealed. They make commons, they make uncommons, and they do enough rares and mythics to support that.
Yeah, so, it was a set.
Yeah, they've play tested it. They've been play testing it. Exploratory is like, let's get weird with it, But Vision Design, they're still getting weird with it, but they're going for that. That is a goal. Like they're not still exploring anymore. It's visionary, but it's still meant to be an actual set. So this had enough meat to it, and that they try to make it work. And that's why it keeps coming up when people get these ideas. Shadow is one of those mechanics where you're like, the seed of this idea of creatures that are able to deal with each other but not these other creatures is good. How do you fix it, right? I've made that mechanic. I know that when I was making it, Tommy helped me out because he's made that mechanic, right? And there's all these different ways to make it work. And they had just unfortunately penciled themselves into a space where they also had to meet a flavorful execution as well, like what Tommy was saying. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And
another problem is that because there are so many returning mechanics, like it's almost like all the design went to nothing. Because how much work does Vision Design have to do to realize we should bring back Devotion, Sagas, and Constellation? You know what I mean? It's almost like all of Vision Design was thrown away if all they offered was Stygian. And like I'm sure there was a lot more to it than that, right? Like, yeah. But from our perspective, this was the thing they sent. I mean, I can't believe that there was no other mechanic backups that they had, or maybe they just had a lot of conviction and set design just wasn't convinced. I don't know.
I think so. Before I mentioned the magic trick, and now I can go into detail about what happened here, right? Which is there was a lot of work behind the scenes. This isn't. There, when you mentioned Constellation, they also tried a gazillion other enchantment mechanics.
And that's the next mechanic that was right. I just put not Stellation because they tried 100 different things and then they realized, oh well, it's just what we really want is Constellation.
Right. And in the article again, they're very clear that they say like we tried Convoke but enchantments. Metalcraft but enchantments, Champion but enchantments, right? And then they're a lot more invasive about the things that were unique. They say things that only showed up on enchantments, mechanics that only work on enchantments, which is an interesting distinction. Things that turn into enchantments that turn into things, right? They clearly were trying a lot of different things. And they're evasive about some of those things because maybe some of them worked. But when you're just trying to make enchantments matter, they very quickly realize just say enchantments matter, right? And it might not sound like they did a lot of work. Like when you see the final project, you go, oh, they just put Constellation back in, and it's on not enchantments sometimes. Cool, right?
Right, but it's still tragic that what comes out of all that work is something that maybe didn't necessarily... It's not like all that work necessarily bore the fruit that they wanted it to.
Exactly.
It's the true Greek tragedy of Theros Beyond Death.
Yes, the set is the tragedy. It's hard because that is still it doesn't give them what they wanted, yes, but it does inform them. Knowing about the things that do and do not work with enchantments will be translated into individual card designs is the hope, right? This mechanic might not make it into the set, but it might inspire the card that makes the set feel more like an enchantment set. And I think we see that in a few of the cards. There was that really weird green uncommon that stops your stuff from being countered and makes creatures based on lands, and also their enchantments. Like it's ridiculous.
Oh, that card's weird.
Yeah, I won't even say the name, because I can't remember. It's a weird card, and it doesn't matter about its details. What matters is that card reeks of the DNA of all these different things they did to care about enchantments. And one of those things might have been turning stuff into enchantment creatures, right? And so that's the kind of thing where, we liked that. Let's make sure it ends up on a card, right? It makes it onto a card.
Or this was the best design that did that. Might as well be. Yeah, Destiny Spinner.
That's it. And when you see the final product, that effort and that ordeal, I think, does translate into some improvement. Whether it's enough improvement or they learned the right lessons, I don't know. But it isn't worthless. But to the average player and audience and amateur designer, you don't see that.
That's fair.
So often you hear people say the designers got lazy, right? And that's rude because they work full days. I don't think they necessarily get lazy for these kinds of things. I do think they sometimes realize that you don't reinvent the wheel in this particular instance, and it can take a lot of effort to make that realization. And of course, they're not going to start there. They don't want necessarily to have all these returning mechanics, but they just realized it was the way to go. Maybe next time they will crack the enchantment mechanic that works better, especially because there will be different variables in the form of not being an underworld set, not having this, not having that, etc. But in this case, it's what we ended up with, and it once again leaves the set feeling a little less like the original Theros.
I will say I think they partially got so raked over the coals the first Theros that there weren't as many cards that screamed enchantments and big flashing lights that they felt they needed to have a mechanic that did that. And in Journey to Nyx, they had Constellation, but they only put it on enchantments, but they sort of realized that Constellation really isn't a great mechanic. And in particular, I think they realized the things you have to do to your set to make Constellation work, as we'll, I'm sure, talk about later, are bad. I think Constellation made them print all kinds of stuff that I think they're well aware they should not print. Like I'm sure we'll talk later about vanilla enchantment creatures and enchantments that are sorceries and all of these things that they had to do to make Constellation quote unquote work by printing enchantments that aren't enchantments, that are really other things. And so I think they really wanted a mechanic, and I know Trevor really, really, really wants this mechanic too, a mechanic about enchantments that lets you print actual enchantments rather than slap enchantment on things that aren't enchantments.